And in my own work, I frankly confess that I prefer portraiture almost on the basis of sculpture. And what I mean by that is that the person's face in repose will very often reveal far more of the character and the individuality. I do a great deal of writing, both of articles and reports, and I have a lot of correspondence with other photographers who are constantly writing in on all kinds of matters, technical and aesthetic, and have a general correspondence. I find myself doing a great deal of work at the typewriter, which annoys my friends and wears out the typewriter ribbons. As a rule, most of the work is all part of the whole cloth. In any art, you're in your ears, and I would say that's my case. The division of time in photography is rather simply stated that perhaps 3/4 of the time is more or less concerned with studying the project and trying to visualize the images and the functions. And what is quite surprising to many people, there's not too much time spent in actual shooting. Of course, it depends on the type of work. News people undoubtedly spend most of their time in the field, whereas serious professionals, especially in advertising, may spend an enormous amount of time in consultation with the agents and the art directors and stylists and so on. But in my particular case, I would say that about 75% is thinking and planning, and 25% is actual shooting and lab work. Of course, added to that as a further complication is the amount of time spent in travel. I think the term professional covers all of us who make our living from the practice of photography.
This is, of course, a professional photograph, as is this photograph of smoke crystals, one of a series taken with the aid of the electron microscope.
I myself, while I find them extraordinarily interesting, am not always able to read in any particular aesthetic significance, because the photographs are made without selection or control in any way.
This, too, is a professional photograph, made on assignment by Dorothea Lange.
Dorothea Lange is a very remarkable artist, and she is able to combine the external and the internal event to a very poignant, moving degree, and her work, while superficially is documentary in character, it also contains a great and deep poetic quality.
A professional photograph of yet a different kind, a photograph of the Pleiades.
Some of the astronomical photographs are amazingly exciting, but again, it is something that is beyond the real control of the operator in the strict sense of the term.
And finally, a professional photograph taken on assignment for Life magazine, a photograph from Eugene Smith's Nurse Midwife series.
Gene Smith's Spanish Village series and his Midwife series are, in my opinion, great milestones in the development of photography. I don't do very much portraiture, but when I do work with a subject, I'm primarily interested in the reaction that I have from that subject at that particular time. I don't have any formula that I'm conscious of. I would like to treat every subject as a completely individual case in every respect. One of the most important aspects of portrait photography is what I call the environmental portrait, which doesn't mean that a lawyer is photographed in front of law books or a chemist in a chemical laboratory, but that the subject is photographed in an environment which conveys a mood or reinforces a mood specifically related to that particular person. And that is instinctively determined by the photographer. It's not a thing that you can cerebrate on. It's all part of what we call the equivalent statement. Portraiture to me is a very specific branch of photography, a rather dangerous one to monkey with unless you really have the ability to handle people in a creative and constructive way. To me, a portrait is much more than a likeness, and yet at the same time, I do not feel justified in literally directing the subject into attitudes and expressions which I would think would be appropriate. I think it is the obligation of the photographer to reveal the subject in terms of the subject himself. We recognize people not only by facial configurations, but both the face and the personality through time. And that is why the so-called candid photograph, which is merely an aspect of a person in a short slice of time, may be either a caricature or an exaggeration or merely nothing as far as the basic revelation of that person's character is concerned. And in my own work, I frankly confess that I prefer portraiture almost on the basis of sculpture. And what I mean by that is that the person's face in repose will very often reveal far more of the character and the individuality of the person than any moment of time or any slice of time taken out of this person's configurations in movement, if we can use that term. The concept of photography is based on pre-visualization of the image, carries through all branches of the work. You will have a certain visualization problem of landscape, and then of course when you get portraiture, you have the personality problem entering in. You can see the ideal photograph in your mind's eye, but you have the expression of your subject to contend with. You have to accept the constantly changing mood and aspect of the subject. But I would say on the whole it would be rather futile to attempt an interpretive photograph without really knowing what you expected to get. And you have a higher percentage of failure with portraiture due to conditions entirely within the subject. But all aspects of any art are, of course, if satisfactorily carried through, are always carried to the highest degree that anyone can take them. And we really can't be careless at any time and at any place. We very often find a competition in one person of two major directions in photography. One is the purely creative, and the other is that of the expedience, the necessity to produce images to satisfy clients. However, any balanced worker will realize that in both cases the craft must be of as high order as possible, and certain adaptation must be made. Here in San Francisco, we have an extraordinarily capable, gifted, professional and commercial photographer, Mr. Milton Halberstadt, who is very well trained in the Bauhaus approach, who has an enormous inventive capacity and a magnificent and flexible technique. Advertising photography is extremely complex. It has many varied functions. It is designed not to mislead, although, of course, some photographs do, and I think intentionally. It is primarily, to my mind, designed to clarify and to convince. And there are many times when certain manipulations of the subject and of lighting and compositional aspects have to be applied in order to create a simulation of reality. And one of the most important differences in this field of professional photography lies in the fact that we have to construct or contrive scenes and subjects in order to convey the essential points which the client wishes the photograph to convey to the spectator, which is this, that the professional has to adapt himself to the problems and the projects and functions of his client. He has to be able to handle the various assignments that come to him, whereas the more or less independent amateur will pick and choose with much more personal satisfaction and intensity. And that is why it is very hard sometimes for people who have practiced and worked entirely in the creative field, much as easel painters do, to adapt themselves to any externally presented problem. The photography of nature, unmanipulated and simple, is one thing. But in all kinds of advertising photography, fashion, food, so on, we do have problems of subject organization. I use the word contrivance here not as a negative term, but as a term which covers the building of sets, the use of varied lighting facilities, the preparation of models, and so on. I think that most of this work represents construction and creation outside of the camera. And the camera then records what the photographer and the artist have produced before it. And that's a very different concept from the creation of important and moving images entirely within the camera, which is one must work with nature or from simple portraiture. Any creative photographer in any field over the years develops a vast resource of experience which is safely tucked away in his subconscious and drawn upon when required. I like to think of this resource in the term as being compared to actual capital. And at any moment when a picture problem presents itself, he draws upon not the capital, but the, let's call the interest from this vast resource. And then he puts back into his resource fund this new and added experience. It's very much like a musician. He is performing masterwork, great complexity in the piano, for example, and he cannot possibly think of every note or even of every phrase as a disjointed thing. It's a sum total expression of a basic concept. And we have this same problem in photography, which, of course, only experience can solve. That is, the fund, the resource in everyone's mind and personality, which can be drawn upon to supply the aesthetic and craft capabilities at any given moment for any given subject. And it includes everything from the very large down to the very small in this mechanical civilization, and even such spectacular, now obsolete objects as this mechanical brain from an old B-17 fire control unit will present unlimited possibilities in composition,